Hello, welcome to Functional Bar. My name is Charles, and today we're going to be talking about command prompt basics for Windows. If you're a Linux or Mac user, you'll want to look at the appropriate video for you and not necessarily this Windows video. And in this video, to break it down a little further, we're going to talk about why we need to know this, how we're going to open the file, and then we're going to talk and how to interpret what we see. Then we're going to review some of these commands and what they're for that we use in the command prompt on a daily basis. And finally, we're going to talk about the differences between Linux and Windows in the command prompt. And the reason you need, as a Windows user, need to know how to work Linux just a little bit is because all of the videos I record are on Linux. The command prompt is very similar between the two, but there are some differences, and you just need to know that what those differences are so you know you're doing it right for you and not necessarily what I'm typing in the Linux command prompt is maybe not what you need to be typing. Sometimes there's very few differences. Almost everything is the same for the commands that we type. So why do we need to know this? In almost all cases, a programmer or developer will need to interact with the command line at least sometimes. There are very few situations when you don't need to interact with the command line. And those usually spring up because sort of vendor lock-in-y type deal where they've prioritized you must use their IDE in order to develop the software. You see that especially on Apple, where you have to use Xcode to develop iOS software. You don't have a choice. It's very difficult not to use it. You can still do command line programming on the Mac. That's just fine. You can, until it comes time to compile for iOS, you can build almost everything from the command line. I believe you do have to launch Xcode for window development, not like MS Windows, but like a window that an application lives in the GUI. So you always are going to have to know how to work a command line. Now, another big reason for learning the command line first is that if you learn the command line first, it's very easy for you to learn how to work an IDE. They were designed with this in mind because all programmers used to be command line programmers. That's just how it was. IDEs came about second. So if you know the foundation technology, the fundamental technology here is a command prompt. If you know that, it's very easy for you to transition up into an IDE. However, if you learn an IDE first for anything but just editing, then the IDE is what you learn and you expect everything to work like that. And you wind up not having a solid understanding of what's actually happening because it's just a button you click and it hides everything else that you see, and you see everything else on the command line. So it's very difficult to learn an IDE first and then transition to the command line generally than it is to learn the command line first and then transition to the IDE. So we're going to be focusing on using command line first, and then you can take that knowledge and apply it to whatever IDE in whatever situation you might need. So how do we open a command prompt? How do we open the command line? How do we get there? On Windows, we press the Windows key, and then we have a choice. And this depends on your version of Windows a little bit. You should start trying to run terminal. This is now the recommended approach on a Windows operating system. Now, if you don't have terminal, that's just fine. I'm going to talk about what to do in just a minute. But first, let's see what happens when we type in terminal. We have a terminal app. We can click on that, or we can just press enter. Now, this is a Windows terminal. This is actually the whole program is terminal, and this is a PowerShell tab. And that's what we want. It says PowerShell because terminal actually opened PowerShell by default. In the terminal program, you have extra tabs you can open and you can play with that. And you see if we click that, we get another PowerShell. We won't be using those, but just so you know what's happening with that plus sign, you have some other options. Now, if you don't have terminal, probably means you're on an older version of Windows. You almost certainly still have PowerShell. So we hit the Windows key and we type PowerShell, and we'll see Windows PowerShell pop up. And we can, again, just click on that or hit enter, whichever we like. And on my version of Windows, they are identical. It gets the same thing. The terminal program opens. We have PowerShell in the tab. It's identical. There's no difference. Now, on older versions of Windows, you might see a blue screen with yellow text. That's normal. That's just how it works. You just have an older version of Windows. Now, if you don't have PowerShell, you're always going to have CMD, or the command prompt is what they call it. Lots of people, or historically it's called as a DOS box, because Microsoft Windows was originally Microsoft DOS long before Windows was invented. And when you booted up your machine, you'd see this thing right here. So we started calling that a DOS box in Windows because it's a box that has DOS in it. Now, command prompt for everything we're doing, the command prompt here, the command line, command.com is going to be just fine. Everything you do in PowerShell, you can do in command prompt for our purposes. Now, I said that backwards. Everything in general, anything command prompt does, PowerShell does, but it does more. So PowerShell is a superset of command.com. So if you use command.com or the command prompt as they call it in this tab, it's great, it's fine for our purposes, you won't run into any trouble, but in general, you should start learning PowerShell first. So if you're a new user, use PowerShell first, and that's because any employment opportunities are really going to expect you to know PowerShell, especially for systems administration, and programmers do need to perform system administrative tasks occasionally, if nothing else than on their own machines and when setting up test environments. So being comfortable with PowerShell is just the best way to, from the start, is the best way to do that. You just add to your knowledge as you continue working with it. But again, command prompt is just fine for everything we're going to be doing. You're not going to miss out. So how do we read this prompt? First, we need to know what a prompt is. So when I say prompt, this is a little bit confusing. They call it command prompt, but what a command prompt in the tab here, what a command prompt actually is this part of the line right here. And if we have multiples, we see several, and really we just mean the last one, the most recent one here. In PowerShell, it's a little bit different than it is in command.com. It starts with a PS space, and that lets us know we're in PowerShell. And it's really important to know which shell you're in because sometimes things don't work if you're in the wrong shell. So in PowerShell, it starts with PS, that prompt starts with PS, so we know we're in PowerShell. In command.com or the command prompt, there's no PS, it just starts with C:. Now you see, after the PS, everything is identical. C:, backslash, users, backslash, Charles, the greater than sign. So let's talk a little bit about what these parts mean. This whole thing is going to be called a path. That part right there is a path. The greater than sign is just a delimiter to let you know the path is done with. C:, means the drive is C. Now, on original DOS machines, and Windows is kept with this convention, so Microsoft machines in general, you start numbering drives or lettering drives from A, B, C, D, E, etc. Historically, A and B were assigned to the first two floppy drives, and C was always assigned to the first hard drive. Now, this is so far back that not everyone had a hard drive. They were quite expensive, so you'd really rely on everyone having an A drive to put everything in. Now it's kind of the reverse. We all use SSD drives, which are the replace or what hard drives evolved into at some point. So we use SSD drives, and they still start the lettering with C on Windows, but no one has a floppy drive, and if you do, it's usually plugged in. USB drives are continue that when you plug in a USB drive, like I have here on this machine, that would be D, and I can just like type D here so you can see it real fast. That there is a D drive attached to this machine, and that's what it would look like. Go back up to C drive though. I would encourage you to, if you're a complete novice to this, I'd encourage you to stick with using C drive and your home directory, and maybe a directory called src or source underneath that, and then you keep all your source files in source, and each of your projects will be in its own directory under source. And that's just a good organizational strategy. Many people use that. You don't have to follow it, but as a new user, I'd really encourage you to do so. So that's how we read the prompt. It's pretty easy. We just, the path here, we're going to talk about the path more when we talk about what a directory is. But first, let's talk about how to launch a program. So when we launch a program, all we have to do is type its name. I'm going to launch Notepad++. It's an editor. I'm going to tell it I want to edit test.txt. And then just hit enter. It pops up the window. I can type whatever I want in here. So hello world, and then save it. So that's Notepad++. That's an editor. That's how we launch it. That's what we're really talking about here. We just type its name. Now we can type this a bit different. I use tab autocomplete because it's easier than typing everything out, but we could just as easily write it this way, and it's still going to work. And the reason is .exe is inferred. Your PowerShell or command.com are both going to know that if we just type a name up in the front with nothing else, we're trying to launch a program, and it goes and looks for a program that has that name. There's only a few extensions on Windows that can execute directly like that. So it looks for those. The difference between /test and test is trivial. / is dot means this directory, / is just the path separator, and it's just a different way to write the same thing. It's test.txt out of this current directory. That works the exact same way on command.com. We type notepad ++test.txt. We don't have tab autocomplete, but we have this same notepad ++ editor open up with hello world inside of it as a text file for test.txt. Now we need to talk about what is a directory. A directory is a container that holds other directories and files. It's really an organizational structure in our file system. So the path tells us what directory we're in. So we start with the root of our file system, this /users. So users is its own directory, and users is a directory that has Charles in it. So let's look at this in the File Explorer. I have it in my taskbar, the File Explorer. If you don't have it in your taskbar somewhere, you can just hit the Windows key and type Explorer. You want File Explorer though, so you make sure it's the file and not IE. And I hope most of you are familiar with this scene right here. There are a few differences that we need to be aware of. This presentation, the File Explorer, is really meant for people who open their computer to do something else. It's really not meant for programmers or systems administrators. It's really targeted, and of course programmers and systems administrators can use it just fine, but it's really targeted at more casual users who are opening their computer just to like read a document or go browse the internet or work on their spreadsheet or something. Excuse me. So there are a couple of minor differences here that make it a little bit confusing. So the first thing is the C users Charles. Now this on your computer, that's going to be your Windows username, not Charles. But that's your home directory. Generally speaking, that's your home directory. But up here, it's different, right? It's not necessarily our home directory, even though this is home. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to go to C:\users /Charles. Now we see this change a lot. So we've got this PC, Windows, users, Charles, and there's no path this PC. That's an artifact of the File Explorer. So if we want to turn that back into a path we can actually work with, we just click in that bar right there, and it turns back into our friendly path in the that would see in the DOS box. Now for writing programs that deal with I/O, this is the path we need. We can't use this in our programs that we write to open a file. We have to use this path here in our programs to open the file. So that's it for what a directory is. It's just a folder in Windows, and a directory is a folder that contains directories and files. Just a container that has directories and files, or in this case it happens to be empty. So let's go look at emacs.d. Here we go, public. It's got a bunch of directories in public, which is just another user directory. So that covers what a directory is. And now, how do we list the files in a current directory? Now, as we've seen in File Explorer, we can look here, but we can also type dir. Dir gives us a list of files in the directory, and we go look in this one, verify we're in C:\users /Charles, and we have the same stuff. We have .cache, we have dbus key rings, we have emacs.d, ms-ad, etc. So we just have a different view of the same data. It's because the file system is the same underneath. Now let's look at a couple of things here. .emacs.d, the dot is, we see a bunch of these dots because I install a lot of Unix software on Windows, and there's various ways to do that. But in this case, the .emacs.d is really meant to be a hidden file, and hidden meaning a program is expected to edit this, not so much a user, or users don't necessarily need to edit it. So it doesn't show up by default when you list files. On Linux systems. On Windows systems, there's a different way to hide files. So it shows up here just fine with our default listing. But anyway, we see .emacs.d, and I want to point out the mode here is a D file, or D type. That mode is D, that means directory. And down here, it's a folder. That's how we know it's a directory. We've got this folder here. And then the last write time, 7/24/24, 3:34 p.m. And then, of course, we go look here, 3:34 p.m. It's got the same modified timestamp. There's a slight difference between write time and modified time. So sometimes you'll see a little bit of a difference, but that's okay. In this case, it's the same. And so we're looking at the same stuff. Now let's go look at command prompt. It's the same command to list our directories, dir. We have the same data, but it's presented again a little bit different. We have, look at emacs.d again. Remember what that is. It's a directory modified 334 and the 24.emacs.d. And we look here, and it's 7/24/24 modified or last written at 3:34 p.m. and it's a directory. The biggest difference for our everyday use is this directory, how we know it's a directory. And if it's in PowerShell, it's got this D on the far left, and it's in command.com or command prompt, it's got just dir with the pointy arrows around it in all uppercase. And that's it. That's the only difference between the two that we really care about. Occasionally, when you're debugging files that get created by your program, you want to pay a lot of attention to this modified time, the last written time, to make sure that it was that it's correct, that it changes. Occasionally, bugs crop up where, like, you run the program once, the file gets created, then you go change something, and the file's never actually written again. You run the program again, and you think the file's being edited or modified or whatever, but it's not. You have to go check the timestamp to make sure that's the case. So that's what that timestamp is for. It's really useful. So now that we know what a directory is, we need to know how to make a directory. And this is pretty easy. mkdir. MK stands for make. This is the case in lots of places. You'll see it in source code. You'll see it in other commands. MK means make. So that's what it is. dir means directory. So this is just really short way of writing make directory. So it's mkdir. And we're going to make, I already have a source. The first thing you should do, though, is type mkdir space source, src. And while we're talking about abbreviations, I'll call it that src is the abbreviation for source. It's almost always used, and especially for more historical or older programs and conventions, we see source almost always spelled src. And that's the case all over because it takes a lot more letters to write source than it does src. And again, we use source and typically we're going to put all of our programming projects in the source directory in our home. So this is going to fail. I already have source, and then we're going to see an error message. And in PowerShell, this looks really scary because there's a whole bunch of red screaming at you. It's not screaming, it's just calling out that something unexpected happened. That's what an error usually is, something unexpected happened. We couldn't complete what we thought. We tried to do it, but we couldn't do it, is all that means. And it's red because it really stands out. And if you're running a script or something, this highlighting here is really helpful. If we were to do the same thing in command prompt, we see this little line here telling us it didn't work. Now there are return codes and things we'll deal with later to make it easy to find out that happened. But for now, this red is really super helpful to let us know that it didn't work, and it gives us a whole lot of error information, which is a little bit opaque to a new user. But once you get used to reading this sort of thing in whatever language you're in, and PowerShell is a language, once you get used to reading the error information, it's really useful data that helps you find out exactly what went wrong. In this case, it's really obvious. It tells us the name already exists, src exists. So let's look at what happens when we do it correctly for a directory that doesn't exist. I'll just do source 2. And in PowerShell, we get this. It looks a lot like the directory output, right? Except for just the file that was created. Again, this is a PowerShell thing to make it easier to use. PowerShell is geared primarily at systems administrators. It works great for everyone else, but primarily for Windows systems administration. And having this feedback that it was created the way you think it should have been is really useful. Command.com is an older program. We'll make directory source 3 because source 2 already exists, and it does nothing. Now, you'll see a lot of times in most shells, a return of nothing means it worked just fine, especially if it doesn't have anything to print. So making a directory doesn't really necessitate printing anything. So not printing anything to the console, nothing here except just hitting return and you get a new prompt, means it worked. And that is the convention most places. PowerShell is a little bit unique in that it shows us a little bit of output here about what happened. Now that we know how to make a directory with mkdir, we're going to change directories, and we change directories with the cd command. Cd space src will get us into source, and then we can look into source to see that we're in a different directory. Now, first of all, we know we change directories because we see, instead of users Charles, we're in users Charles source. We type dir, and we see we have a different directory listing now. We don't have the same stuff as we did just a minute ago. And of course, in command.com, it works the same as it does. We just cd, and we see the /src is appended to our path. Our path has changed. So that's all we do to change directories. Now, one really common thing we do when we change directories is cd space ... That says go to the directory above us. And in this case, it's going to be the directory to the left. So users /Charles /source, / is the path separator. cd ... says go back one path separator. So it's going to take us to Charles. And we'll see users Charles. Now, real fast here in the command.com version of dir, we see dot. That means this directory. So sometimes you're going to see /, say this directory / some file or some other directory for the command. That's used especially when we're trying to execute a program that we're building in a very specific directory, usually the one we're currently in. That might happen because we have 6 different versions of that executable because we're debugging something. We want to use the one that's in this directory. We want to be absolutely certain of it. All right, now we know how to change directories. Pretty easy, cd space. Now let's talk about an absolute path versus a relative path. We hinted at it earlier. We've seen relative paths. We've used them. We just didn't call it that. ... is a relative path. It is relative to the current directory. It says go up a directory. And in Windows, it's really easy to say if we're in a relative path or not. An absolute path always starts with C, or always starts at a drive letter. It doesn't have to be C. It could be A, B, or D, or whatever. It's drive letter : /. That's how we know we're in an absolute path. There is a tiny bit of confusion about whether the / should be part of an absolute, should count if we just did cd that. Is that an absolute path or is it not? On Windows, I would argue that it is not an absolute path because it is relative to the drive letter, right? If we're in a different drive, it takes us to a different directory. So it is not an absolute path. Let's go back. This is how we can cd with an absolute path. And now we're back to where we were. And that's just cd space and the absolute path. And all of this is going to work exactly the same in command on the command prompt or command.com. You don't have to worry about it. This is all the same stuff. A relative path does not start with C : /. It starts, or drive letter : /. It just starts with a / or a dot / or nothing. So cd space source. That takes us into our source directory relative to Charles. We can do cd / source. This explicitly says relative to where I'm at. / relative to where I'm at. Go to source. And we do that sometimes when we want to be more explicit about what's happening. We seldom would type cd /, but you do need to see it because when we autocomplete PowerShell by hitting tab autocompletes. PowerShell is going to fill that out with a more explicit notation for us. including this / handily added to the end, which again isn't particularly necessary, but there's nothing wrong with it at all. So for us, we need to distinguish between absolute paths and relative paths, because when our programs run, especially build systems, they typically want to use absolute paths because they're always changing directories. It doesn't necessarily, the build system doesn't necessarily know what directory it's going to be in. So a popular one called CMake, you'll specify it in relative paths, and then it's going to turn everything into absolute paths for you to make sure you know what file is being read and write in its output when it logs stuff. That's really, really useful because there's no ambiguity there. But when we're deploying source code to other people, we want to focus generally on relative paths, especially within a source tree. The source tree is everything associated with the project, and you'll get a feel for that as we go on. But we do need to know the difference here. And when we're testing programs, we often want an absolute path, so know exactly where to look, because programs don't always run in the directory we think they're going to run in. They can run in a completely different directory sometimes. So an absolute path for testing is often very useful, especially for just local testing. When we're remote testing, we want to make sure that relative paths are used again. Now let's talk about, real fast, some of the differences between Linux and Windows. And again, this is only because most of the videos I make, I'm going to be recording on a Linux box. There are very few differences that you need to be aware of when you're watching those videos versus what you type on your command prompt. It's just going to look a little bit different. I'm going to open up Ubuntu for Windows. This uses WSL2 or Windows Subsystem for Linux 2. It's essentially a virtual machine running a copy of Ubuntu. So our prompt looks different. Don't let that throw you for a loop. We've already seen two different prompts here. This one's just a different way of presenting similar information. Where did that guy go? This has my username at Jarvis-Windows, so it's username at host. Now on a Linux box, that would actually be a valid email address for that host. At least historically, newer distros may not include a mail server on their own, but you can still install it and make that work. Now it's not exposed on the internet at all, it's just local to this machine. But that's why we have it, because Linux has forever been a multi-user system, so the username, who you're running as, is really important. So it presents that first, and then which host you're on, because we often telnet or SSH to other hosts in order to remotely administer those systems or work on those systems. So we need to know what computer we're on. Followed by a colon. So we have all of this, the user name and the host, followed by a colon, followed by a tilde. Now on tilde for bash means the home directory. It's just a simple alias for the home directory. And in fact, it works in PowerShell as well. If we do, let's say we're just // if we do cd tilde, my home directory, that's what it turns into. It says // uses Charles. It does not work on command.com. Command.com is too old for it, but it does work in PowerShell if you're using PowerShell. That tilde is just an alias for the home directory. So that's all that means. And then we have a $sign. The $sign doesn't really mean anything special. It's the same thing as this. If you saw a hash mark instead of a $sign, that would mean you're logged in as root. So you'd have root at this, colon, whatever the path is, hash. In most systems, a hash would be used to indicate your root. That's just, some extra knowledge that you can destroy the whole machine accidentally. If you're not logged in as root, you can only destroy your local directory tree, not the whole system. And you can destroy the whole system as root really easily. We can change directory just the same. It's the same command exactly. When we're looking around, the only thing is we have ls instead of dir. We don't have the drive letter. pwd is a command that says list the present working directory. cwd is often used instead, current working directory versus present working directory. And on Linux, our paths don't have a drive letter. They just have a we don't have a drive letter. We just have a path. And that's because Linux has a single root for the whole system and distinguishes different drives based on different directories. That's not something we're really ever going to get into in any of these videos. If you're curious about it, you can read or watch videos on Linux administration. For us, we don't need to worry about it too much. What we care about is where our source directory is, and that tilde means we're in our home directory, so it's much shorter, /source. The path separator is also different. I should call that out. We have forward slashes, not backward slashes. Now on Windows, you can almost always use the forward slash instead of the backward slash. So this is how it should be written in PowerShell or the command prompt, either one. And that works as we'd expect it to. But we can also write with the forward slash. And that's because most systems use forward slash as a path separator. So when we're writing our programs, and if we have to hard code a path, a relative path, we can use a forward slash for that, and it's going to work just fine on Windows. And I think that covers it for the major differences. You're going to see it just looks a little bit different. All the tools we use are going to work exactly the same. So you could type stack new. This is probably one of the first things we're going to be using. Test doesn't like the dashes. See lots of error messages, and that's fine. Compilers often give us this. And it stack new test project, and it makes a whole test project for us. We've got some output that means some different things. And that command, that exact command, stack new test project, works on PowerShell. It's going to work in command.com exactly as it does PowerShell. So most of our commands, if not all, for our development and compilation are going to be exactly the same between Linux and Windows. There are just a few differences, and it's whether we use the backslash or the forward slash primarily, but also the dir instead of ls. On Windows, we use dir to get a directory listing. And in fact, if you're using PowerShell, you can also use ls. It'll be just perfectly happy to execute ls. It knows that lots of people switch between them, and so they provide ls for us. And that's it for this video. As always, questions and comments are welcome. Please click like and subscribe. Thank you for watching our video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.